introductions, and before we get into it, I think there's a few more people in the waiting room coming in, so that's great. So thanks very much for joining us this afternoon. So this is a webinar that's part of the Productivity Insights Network and picks up on a particular piece of work led by Adam Brown at Cambridge Econometrics, looking at research and innovation in the north of England. It's great that we've got Adam alongside Jen Nellers and Dieter Kogler, who are going to be presenting this afternoon. If you do have any questions, please put them in the chat, make them clear, and I, in sharing the latter half of the conversation, will try and incorporate all of those questions. So keep them coming. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Adam. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Tim. So firstly, just a few acknowledgements. This work was not just done by myself, Jen and Dieter, but also had a number of other contributors. Costas and Alex from Cambridge Econometrics, Paul Vallance and Kevin Walsh from the University of Sheffield, Tim himself, Ben Gardner from Cambridge Econometrics, and we also had a very helpful steering group, which comprised Emma Wood, Tim Foster from Transport for the North, Rick Holland of Innovate UK, Richard Baker from the Northeast LEP, Annette Bramley from the N8 Research Partnership, and Sarah Bowes from the West Yorkshire Combined Authority, and they were very helpful throughout. So just to kind of give a brief overview of our approach. So basically, the study was originally kind of commissioned by Transport for the North in the first half of this year. And really, it was to kind of look at the research and innovation ecosystem across the north of England, compare it with the wider country, and try and understand some of the drivers and think about some policy recommendations. There were four different stages to this. So the first approach was a literature review, synopsis as to the nature of the innovation process, so looking at some of the theory and evidence as to that, that then kind of built towards the construction of a logic map of the kind of the main stages, pathways, drivers and barriers of that process. So that was very much a kind of conceptual first step. We then operationalized some of that, some of the metrics, some of the variables we identified, collected the data, analyzed them. That then allowed kind of a bit of an understanding of what was going on in the north of England and comparisons between that geography and other areas of Britain. Then there was a slightly different, two different stages to finish off. Firstly, we did a bit of a deep dive into two particular data sets. So firstly, looking at patent application data and also Innovate UK funding data. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of that analysis today. And finally, we did some case studies that were kind of intended to demonstrate how the logic map actually kind of played out in reality, kind of using real world examples. Unfortunately, because this is quite a big study, we've got quite a lot to get through. We're not going to talk about those today, but that was part of the overall project plan. So what we're going to talk about in this presentation. So firstly, the innovation process, and Jen's going to take you through some of the conceptual mapping we did there. We'll then talk about how we operationalize some of that, analyze the data to look at kind of regional innovation patterns. And I'll talk through that. And finally, Dieter's going to talk through some of the theory and evidence about regional knowledge spaces and how this applies, particularly to the north of England. So I'm going to hand over now to Jen, who's going to talk through the theory and logic mapping element.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. So just Adam has the control of the slides, so I'm just going to have to work around that sort of. So I think we go to the next one. Yeah, perfect. Okay, so I think this is the definition that we used for innovation, which is sort of a good place to start if you're trying to understand the innovation process. A big point here is that this definition is very deliberately broad, and it aims to capture all sorts of sources of quote unquote new practical knowledge, including things like process innovation. This is the OEC definition that was adopted by Eurostat and the UK Innovation Survey. So there's a bit of a precedent to using this to anchor policy type of work. And I think if we go to the next one, we can get into how we've conceptualized the innovation process, which is slightly different from what you may have seen in the past. So this builds on actually quite a lot of academic work, several generations of work on innovation processes, and mashes together a couple of things that are often considered separately. And we've sort of conceptualized these as interlinked stages of an innovation process rather than just innovation kind of as an outcome. The knowledge creation, value creation, and diffusion stages. So knowledge creation is essentially the research, discovery, idea having phase. Ideas can lead to something that can be commercialized in the market, or it can be implemented internally as new practices or processes. So we've got the implementation and commercialization boxes there. And we describe that phase basically as value creation. Here we're talking about, just having an idea by itself doesn't like actually lead to anything, but you need to actually do things with that idea in this implementation or commercialization process to extract value from it. So that's why we sort of separate that out as something distinctive. And in the diffusion phase, knowledge of the innovation or the knowledge itself is disseminated, and that can happen by all sorts of various means that are not limited to the market, and then eventually adopted by whether it's end users or other parts of the innovation system. And you'll notice that there are like a bunch of lines between them. That's the theme of this sort of phase of the research, is that there are lines going everywhere. Because we're conceptualizing this as a process that's not necessarily linear, which means that you can go from the left to the right, and that's how you sort of traditionally think of an innovation process working. But there are all sorts of points at which you can have interaction between stages, or where ideas can kickstart the process over again in these sort of feedback loops. So those arrows kind of heading backwards from the boxes are trying to convey that. This innovation process it's interesting in and of itself, and like the reason that we separate it out into these various components is, just to understand this a little bit better for ourselves, but this also fits into our discussion about drivers and enablers of innovation. And I think if we go to the next slide, we can see that. Sorry, it's just taking a second to load. Okay, so when we were thinking about that innovation process, we were asked to specifically engage with and explore what the drivers, which are the factors that directly influence the innovation process, were, and what enablers were, which are the factors that influence the presence or effectiveness of key drivers in that innovation process. And so we also flirted with the idea of barriers here, which are like, they're difficult to conceptualize, but basically we've thought of this as either the absence or weakness of any of the drivers or enablers that can, under certain circumstances, have negative effects on innovation or diffusion. But we're really just going to focus on drivers and enablers on a conceptual level here. We've got a list of them to the right. I'm not going to go through them in detail, although they're going to pop up a little bit in what Adam talks about. Nothing in there that's like really mind-bogglingly new, probably, but how we conceptualize them with respect to the innovation process is what I think is novel about what we're doing here. And if we go to the logic map, you will see what I mean about that. I was not joking about the arrows, right? Arrows everywhere, going all over the place. So here what we're doing is we've arrayed we've got the innovation process at the bottom, the drivers in this sort of middle tier, and then the enablers on the upper level. And this is really derived from it's inspired by a systems or a complex systems approach. So basically what we're saying here is that we don't look at each one of the drivers as feeding into a single innovation outcome. We're actually looking at where they fit into the innovation process. And there's all sorts of other observations and like points that I want to draw out here. The drivers enablers, they affect this innovation process, but you'll note that there's also links between them. So they affect each other. So you'll see that the knowledge base is connected to human capital profile, because of course those things would be connected and influence one another. But when you see typical diagrams that try and visualize processes like this, they're often not actually, those links are not drawn out. So that's something that we do kind of explicitly in our map here. This sort of configuration is important for a bunch of different reasons. So first, it recognizes, if you see it, that the same drivers can but don't necessarily have different effects at different stages of the innovation process. So where you see something like knowledge base attached to research and discovery, the type of influence that it will have on that phase of the idea creation process will probably be different from what's happening in the dissemination phase. And we want to point out that, like, while it's the same driver, the dynamics that are at play are slightly different. And that's something that we wanted to pull out of this from a conceptual point of view. It also, this type of model recognizes that, and the links between it, that affecting change in a given driver or metric may depend on interventions in other drivers or enablers. So actually creating a change in a knowledge base, for instance, may involve direct interventions there, but it could also actually involve intervening on human capital profile or any one of the enablers as well. So that's something that we wanted to pull out of that. And that the other sort of flip side of that is that an intervention in any one of these areas specifically will have reverberating consequences on other drivers and other enablers as well. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. I think acknowledging these impacts encourages us to look beyond single factor policy approaches and to identify chains of factors, or what we call critical paths, that could be better optimized to drive innovation. It also encourages us to think about the innovation processes in places as part of even broader dynamic systems. So this is really an endogenous, conceptualized as sort of an endogenous model at the moment, but if you think about the lines in between these drivers and enablers, and thinking about this as nested within regional, national, international systems, that's something that we wanted to pull out as well. The next slide, I think we talk about a little bit about geographies of innovation, where we go beyond, again, sort of pick up on that theme and go beyond endogenous growth. Here we're focusing on thoughts on networks of collaboration, networks of knowledge flows, and how the sort of fuel of innovation circulates, not just within places, but between places. And this will come out as sort of important in some of our case studies that we're not going to get to, I think, in this, but also some of the work that Dieter and Adam did. We know that innovation doesn't happen in isolation. We argue that access to these external assets and the quality of networks of knowledge exchange and conduits of other types of resources may be a key explanatory factor in north-south. Here, I feel like north-south, we'll get into whether that's appropriate or not in a second, but in spatial differences in the UK. And all of this prompted us to look more closely at internal factors, drivers, but also the composition of knowledge spaces. So trying to understand what knowledge spaces look like in places relative to the rest of the country, as well as to look for gaps and weaknesses in external networks. And there we looked specifically at collaboration networks for research and like research funding and cluster case studies. But before getting into that, I think Adam's going to take us through the indicators and some of the sort of bigger themes that we got out of our more empirical analysis.
Yeah, thank you, Jen. So obviously the next step after creating this quite detailed conceptual logic map of the drivers, enablers, and metrics of the innovation process was to try and operationalize it in some way, to try and identify data or indicators that could be used to try and represent some of these variables. So this was quite a big undertaking. So we collected a huge range of data at the local authority district or LEP level for Great Britain. So that is England, Wales, and Scotland. Unfortunately, we didn't have the same level of data availability for Northern Ireland, so that wasn't included. The table on the left shows the metrics in blue, the drivers in green, and the enablers in red or pink. and the different metrics or indicators that we used to try and capture them. So just some caveats of these. So some of these are obviously better proxies than others. Some of them are quite direct measurements or indicators. Some of them are a little bit more roundabout. This isn't an exhaustive list. It was more of a kind of an attempt to kind of a focused and measured list, just trying to pick a couple of good indicators for each of the different factors that we've got there. And it drew on a wide range of sources. So everything from kind of the standard kind of ONS sources. We relied quite a lot on Enterprise Research Centre survey data, also used patents, skills survey, and then some more novel data sets, things like Meetup, TechNation, Ofcom, Nesta, and we also used Innovate UK and Research Excellence framework data. So you can see there's kind of a wide range of different data indicators. And this enabled us to do quite a detailed analysis. So as I say, we collected it at either the LAD or LEP level, so that's Local Enterprise Partnership. We actually analysed it over the LEP level. That was the geographical level that was felt kind of most useful and appropriate in terms of trying to understand local innovation ecosystems. And I'm not going to go through every bit of analysis that we did, or every kind of conclusion, or show you every bit of data. I'm just going to pull out a few things that we kind of found particularly interesting, to kind of give you a little bit of a narrative of something we found. So as well as kind of striking variations within the North that we're probably not going to talk about, I thought what might be interesting to talk about was spatial variations across England. So here, what we found was there was actually quite a consistent spatial pattern across a number of the indicators that we used as proxies for innovation activity, so the various stages of the innovation process. And that pattern revealed not so much a north-south divide, but the presence of an area, which is the area circled very loosely in red. So this isn't a kind of a well-defined area. It's kind of more of a kind of a vague. There is an area in Southern England where things seem to be operating in a different way, at a different level to the rest of the country. And what we found was that area seemed to lead across the majority of different measures of innovation in some way. The area is more extensive than just the Oxford to Cambridge arc, which is kind of often referenced. But then at the same time, it's also not the entirety of the south. It doesn't cover the whole of East Anglia, Kent. It certainly doesn't seem to cover Devon or Cornwall. Rather, it seems to be an area that covers parts of 5 different UK NUTS1 regions. So southeast, east of England, parts of the southwest, a little bit of the West Midlands, it seems, and also kind of the whole of London. To illustrate this, I've shown 2 different maps. These are 2 maps. We could have picked several different maps, but the left-hand map shows the total patents per 10,000 adults, and the right-hand map is taken from the ERC survey, looking at the proportion of firms undertaking marketing and or strategy innovation. As I say, these are just kind of 2 measures, but this did represent a kind of a wider pattern that we observed when looking at the metrics that measured activity and innovation itself. So why is this? Well, so and I want to kind of emphasize here that this was not and was never intended to be a rigorous econometric analysis. Rather, it was a process that was driven by our logic model. So it's very much a kind of a theory-driven piece of analysis. So we looked to see where the data specifically appeared to support some of those flows or kind of change through the logic, through our logic map, and kind of supported some of those conceptual links. And we found kind of four different things that I was just kind of going to highlight here as to why we think this area seems to do particularly well on innovation metrics. So the first one we observed was something to do with the proximity to London and its international airports, which probably isn't a surprise to anyone. We're all aware of the enormous presence of London within the kind of the south of England and its influence on the surrounding geographies. But this seems to be borne out in the data. So if you look at the 3 different maps, the left-hand one shows an estimate of airport accessibility, so clustered around the north, the west, and the south of London, essentially. The central map shows the proportion of businesses with headquarters overseas, which obviously is spatially correlated to airport accessibility and a wide and access to London, a wide range of other measures. You can probably figure out roughly why there's a high proportion of businesses with overseas headquarters in those kind of highlighted geographies. And then the right-hand map shows the VC or venture capital investment cases per 10,000 visitors, 10,000 businesses. Again, we're seeing this particular kind of region. I haven't repeated the red circle in every diagram, but again, you can kind of see this spatial pattern starting to emerge. Second factor we found, or observation, I guess you could say, it's not necessarily an urban area. This area, it's a mixture of large cities, smaller cities, and quite a lot of rural areas. But it is consistently an area with high amenity values, which tends to make it quite attractive to migrants. Is the kind of the flow through the model, both domestic and international. So the evidence we pulled together here. So if you look at the left-hand diagram, don't worry too much about the shading of the colors here, but rather just the ones that are shaded rather than just white. So this gives you the top 50 places to live according to the Halifax Quality of Life Survey. So again, seem to be clustered in this area in the central to the south of England to some degree. The middle map here, quite interesting. So it's the proportion of population that is settled, that is not moved over the previous 12 months. And here the darker shades are the areas where there tends to be more movement. So there tends to be more people moving around. And again, there seems to be a spatial pattern emerging here where our high performing area in terms of innovation metrics seems to be a place where there seems to be more movement in and out of the area. So there seems to be kind of more migration in and out. So it tends to be a little bit more transient. It doesn't tend to be just kind of the same people living there year in, year out. And finally, and I think partially as a result of the previous two, the right-hand diagram suggests, is a measure of the proportion of working age residents with NVQ4 plus qualifications. And again, you can see there is definitely a spatial correlation here between this area in central southern England that seems to perform well on innovation metrics and has also accumulated significant levels of human capital over time. This isn't necessarily driven by the presence of universities, although that helps in terms of producing the graduates. We do think it's probably, and we'll come to this in a minute, to do with attracting graduates as much as producing graduates. So third observation, there's definitely high levels of public spending on research and development by both universities and other research institutes in this area. The logic map and the literature review that underpin that suggested that there is strong evidence that this kind of public R&D expenditure does tend to crowd in rather than crowd out business R&D investment in the local or regional innovation ecosystem through both kind of knowledge spillovers, but also as an initial pull factor of high skill migrants. So the reason why people perhaps first move to that area and then stay on and offer their human capital to private R&D institutions or firms. And the three diagrams, the three maps here, so you've got the three different groups of research staff essentially. So the left-hand one is your university research staff, again focused strongly around Oxfordshire and Cambridgeshire and Peterborough left. The central one is your central government research staff. Again, there seems to be an accumulation of that within the central southern part of the country. And most prominently, your business and NGO research staff in the right-hand map. So there were kind of three observations. The final one, I think, is probably the one that's most interesting. What we also observed, as the map shows here, is a greater propensity and ability to collaborate. So the map here is of the proportion of innovation active firms that collaborate for innovation. And again, you can see a really strong spatial correlation with this area that does well on innovation metrics in general. So this was something that we did a bit of a deep dive into to try and understand about this area that meant there was more collaboration going on, and tried to kind of characterize that through some network analysis. So we created some network graphs, and I'll show you these now. So the two bits of data we looked at to analyze these, firstly, were patent co-invention statistics from multiple different inventors. So this is from the European Patent Office. And then also we kind of tried to test the validity of the assumptions or the conclusions we drew from that by also looking at some Innovate UK funding co-application data across multiple firms. So I'll show you these now. So firstly, this is the patent co-innovation data. So these are all co-inventions between 2001 and 2015. And what we've done here, so the patent co-invention data, we'll give a bit more detail on how kind of patents work and the patent data, or the information that contains shortly. But effectively, what one thing it contains is the registers of addresses of different co-inventors. So a single patent might have multiple co-inventors. So these are the actual people rather than the firms generally who worked on the patent and are responsible for its invention. And you get the kind of the residential addresses of these. We've then taken that and we've figured out what LEP area they lived in. And then we've mapped whether or not there were kind of co-invention relations between different LEP areas, and we've looked to create a network map showing that. The details of the map, so you have to kind of put a cutoff on these things, otherwise it just looks like a complete mess. So we've put a cutoff of 50 co-inventions. So if there's less than 50 co-inventions between two different LEP areas, or the resident populations of different LEP areas, it's not shown. As it is, like a lot of these lines are significantly greater than 100 or 1,000 co-inventions. The darker, thicker lines indicate stronger connections. And then we kind of lay it out in a way where we can see the patterns most clearly. And so what do we observe? So firstly, there's quite a lot of neighbouring LEPs that seem to have links together. So Greater Manchester is linked to Cheshire and Warrington, it's linked to Lancashire, it's linked to D2N2. So there tends to be a kind of a sideways kind of movement between LEPs. So we think to some extent that's probably a result of inventors who perhaps work at the same firm, but one of them commutes over a LEP boundary and the other one doesn't. In terms of the LEPs that have the greatest number of connections to other LEP areas through this measure, so London emerges strongly as the largest kind of hub in the network. It's got connections to 11 different places using this measure. There are 7 other smaller hubs that have 6 or more connections. These are all shown in yellow. And I think what's interesting here is that 6 of these 7 are in the southeast and 1 is in the Midlands, but there are none in the north, essentially. And actually, I think if you look at the map, you can see there's a really clear picture here emerging, where you have this quite dense network within the kind of the greater southeast. So this kind of corresponds to our area that we identified as being particularly high performing according to our innovation metric. So there seems to be some kind of link between the density of the network, the spatial network between LEPs, and also its ability to perform well on a wide range of innovation measures. And the kind of the north and the Midlands and the kind of the west of England and Wales seem to just have kind of links more to their neighbouring areas, and there seems to be less linkages across wider spatial areas. So that's what we found from the patent data. We also analysed Innovate UK funding co-applications, and here we saw a slightly different network map, but one with, I think, a similar message. So again, this was based on firms' addresses this time rather than residential addresses, and it's based on successful Innovate UK funding applications. A lot of these involve multiple firms. So obviously, if you have an application that has multiple firms, you can identify examples of collaboration that are occurring across LEP boundaries. Here, there was kind of more of these, so the cutoff was a little bit higher in 100 co-applications, and again, same thing. The dark, thick lines indicate the strongest connections. Most LEP areas have between 1 and 5 connections. London, it was reasonably dominant in the previous map. It's even more dominant here. So firms in London seem to be collaborating with pretty much every other LEP area in the country. This is kind of the hub of the network. There's just a lot more collaboration going on that involves London firms. There are 3 other kind of regional sub-hubs, as we've observed. So firstly, Greater Cambridge, Greater Peterborough seems to have a little bit of a eastern sub-network around it. Down to the bottom of the diagram, you can see Enterprise M3 seems to be surrounded by other firms around kind of the south or the west of the country. And then there's a bit of a Midlands hub based around Coventry and Warwickshire. So there's a few different kind of sub networks within the overall network, which is centered around London. And again, no hub in the north. So there's a bit of a message there in terms of the implications for the performance of the north as a whole, and perhaps why it isn't hitting the metrics of innovation process or the innovation measures that this kind of high performing area in the central southern section of the country seems to be. So what are the lessons for the north? So this was originally this work was originally aimed at northern policymakers, so they wanted to know, well, what does this mean for us? So 5 observations here. So firstly, and this is mainly kind of observations about what seems to be going on in this strong area of the country where it does seem to be doing well at innovation. So firstly, we found that innovation isn't exclusively an urban phenomena. There seems to be a benefit of having a variety of lifestyle offers, high levels of amenity. The implications here being that northern policymakers shouldn't only focus on urban areas, and if they want to attract this high-skilled workforce that seems to have a kind of quite a strong relationship between ultimate innovation outcomes, amenity matters. And the amenity is very important here. However, collaboration networks seem to be a crucial factor as well. And one of the key drivers of the collaboration network we observe in the south of the country seems to be the presence of London and its kind of ability to act as a fulcrum. So how can the north build a collaboration network like the one we observe, this kind of dense collaboration network we see across the south of the country? And London is key to that. It seems to, even though not all the innovation happens in London, it seems to be facilitated by proximity to London. London seems to act as a collaboration hub, and also its international connectivity helps. So the presence of Gatwick, Heathrow, other airports surrounding it seems to kind of help. Seems to be one driver amongst many here. So what does the north need to do to replicate this? Does it need a similar fulcrum? We think air connectivity has been important in the past. Obviously, priorities are changing. What kind of connectivity will be important in the future? Will it be HS2? Open questions. And a couple of other observations. So firstly, the high performance area, what we call the high performance area in the south, it doesn't follow NUTS 1 boundaries. It actually covers 5 different NUTS 1 areas. So the thinking of northern leaders shouldn't just be limited to arbitrary regional boundaries either. You don't draw a line between Cheshire and Staffordshire and say this is us, that isn't. You think about how these interactions, how these collaborations go across boundaries. And finally, there's been a lot of call for higher levels of public spending on R&D by things like universities and research institutes. In the north, we think that is a major factor. We think that is a justified recommendation. But the real question here is, if you are going to invest public money on expanding R&D in the north, what should be the focus? So what technologies, what sectors, what international kind of growing markets do we need to be looking at there? What grand challenges do we need to address? And to answer this, we really need to think a little bit more about the North's knowledge space and trying to dig into that question a little bit. So that is exactly what we did, and I will pass over to Dieter, who will talk you through his analysis on the Northern and the British regional knowledge space.
Okay, Adam, thanks very much, and hello everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I will turn off my video as my internet connection is a little bit slow, so I hope you don't mind. Yes, Adam, if you go one slide forward, the main contribution to this project on my end was really on knowledge production and how knowledge translates then into novel products and processes. Now, the methodological tool I'm using here is the regional knowledge space methodology. And in terms of data, I usually use patents, publications, trademarks. And for this project, we mainly focused only on patents. So let me start just to explain a little bit this idea of regional knowledge spaces. It's something I came up with quite a few years ago, was then also funded by the European Research Council in a dedicated project. And I think it's a pretty simple conceptualization of economic reality. The main idea behind it was that We of course live in a world that's networked, that's relational, so things connect to each other. We want to capture that. There's also a realization over the past 20, 30 years that economies are not erratic. They don't change overnight. There's a kind of evolutionary trajectory to economies, especially regional economies. And you could think about yourself, like you can't be a chemical engineer one day and then a GP the next day and so on. Like you kind of build up specializations over time, and that could be very positive, could be also negative if you're locked in. And then finally, we also try to address a little bit this old question of specialization versus diversity that has been around for a long time. Obviously, specialization having the advantage of being more efficient, being more productive, and so on, whereas diversity, of course, provides the whole notion of combining knowledge from different parts into something novel. So this whole idea of cross-fertilization of ideas and so on. So in terms of visualizing this, what we see here is two kind of diagrams. On the left-hand side, I tried to kind of conceptualize economic or industrial sectors. They, of course, are also can be broken down into subsectors. And then at the intersection, we have this whole idea of recombinant knowledge. So as theory goes, the most advanced and novel things should be at the intersection. Was already Schumpeter in the 1930s, 40s, who wrote that most novel knowledge is not really novel per se, it's a new combination of existing capabilities into something new. And if you then look at the right-hand side, of course, this translates into a network where the nodes would indicate different knowledge domains. The size would see how dominant that type of knowledge is, so the frequency of use, whereas the relative position of each node to another one indicates how frequently are those two types of knowledge combined into a product and a process. So if you have nodes on the opposite spectrum, left or right or up or down, those are most likely never combined, whereas the ones in the center seem to be very central. I mean, if you could think in terms of cooking, salt and pepper would be probably in the middle. They applied everywhere, right? Whereas more exotic ingredients would be more at the edges. They are not only smaller, most likely, because they are not frequently used, but they're only mixed with certain things rather than with everything. So if we go forward one slide, please, Adam. How do we operationalize now this whole idea of a knowledge space? And like I said, there's different data sources we can use. For this project, we mainly focused on pattern data. Now, pattern data, there's pros and cons, of course, so like with every data source. The beauty on pattern data is it's a record that has an immense amount of information. It all starts with the pattern classification. It's a very sophisticated type of hierarchical system of knowledge. So we see this pattern has 4 classes that derive from different domains. So from there, we kind of get the networks in terms of how often are certain classes combined with each other and so on. It also has the information about inventors. So the whole idea, it captures where knowledge is actually produced. So when inventors fill in the patent application, the question is, where have you resided at the time you worked on this project or on this novel product or process? People sometimes confuse this. So of course, most inventors live to close proximity to a firm, but it could be also contract inventors that live somewhere completely different. So we derived the networks of co-inventorship from those addresses, basically. Then it, of course, has a timestamp, so it allows us to do a time series, long-term kind of investigation, and it also tells us a little bit about the companies that are associated. In the old days, you probably would have found a lot of patents that might be even applied to by individuals. It's more rare nowadays. Of course, R&D is expensive. It's mostly initiated and managed by corporations and firms and so on. So having said this, I guess some of the caveats of patent data, it doesn't capture every innovation. Of course, if we have things that are extremely rare and difficult to replicate, we might opt for secrecy rather than for patent protection. We might not patent very small incremental innovations and so on. But in large, it has been established that patent data is, of course, a good indicator for knowledge production and the innovativeness of a place. Okay, let's go forward. One slide, please, Adam. Thanks so much. So in terms of the patent data, I talked a little bit about the classes. So what we usually apply, there's 650, they're called corporate patent classification classes. Here I group them into 8 main kind of categories. And we just see the regional specializations between our different LEPs. And of course, it's more of a traditional approach. So you go into a place and you see what do they do, and then you can map this very nicely. Now, if we go one slide forward, then we try to do a little bit more than just realizing what's already there in a place. So we looked at the growth over time. So we took 5-year windows just to smooth out a little bit the data, late 80s, early 90s to 2011-15. And we looked at the UK as a whole. So I know this isn't quite a benchmarking exercise, but nevertheless. And what we see here, so remember I just said before, there's 650 different patent classes we could observe, or we do observe. We only list the top 20 here in terms of UK growth, and then we break them down into different geographies like the Northern Powerhouse, the Midlands Engine, and so on. What we see here is the overall specialization of the UK probably in life sciences and in digital sectors over the, let's say, 20 or so years. And then, of course, we see strong variations between the different geographies, where the South is probably much more specializing in electronics and physics, computing, whereas in the North here we see still chemistry, materials, to some extent also textiles, process engineering more dominating. I guess what I want to point out here is, as you can see, that the 20 classes, right, it's a highly skewed distribution. So this would go on to 650 classes. So the majority, a small minority of classes contributes the majority to growth and change, I guess. That's what I want to point out here. So if we go one slide forward, I think then we get a little bit more to the idea of how to use this information now in a kind of network relational context. So what we see here is the evolution of the knowledge space in the North. So we have 3 time periods here. If you go from the top to the bottom, we color coded according to the 8 main classifications again. And what we see is a little bit this notion of evolution, right? So it's not like the knowledge space has entirely changed over the 20-25 years. It actually has grown, of course, so, but that's not a surprise. It grows pretty much everywhere, so that's not unique to the North. It has further concentrated in classes that have been already specializations back in the late 80s. So this kind of the red and purple nodes. Again, those are not necessarily surprises, as those would be large nodes in most European regional economies. Those are just classes that are very universal. They are applied to many different products, so they usually come out big everywhere. But what we see, especially in the bottom right, 2011, 2015, is that the North has managed to start specializing in certain areas of the knowledge space that are not necessarily central, like physics. We see there quite a bit, electronics, and so on. And that's basically where we want to pick up. It's exactly there where you find local specialization paired with the opportunity to combine parts of the knowledge space that have been previously unconnected into something new and generate value. And if we would now project forward, let's say another 5 years or another 10 years, if we think in terms of investment opportunities, it's exactly there where you would think in terms of the knowledge space that investment should yield good returns. Not necessarily in the space that's so crowded already, so that's saturated, that's probably driven more by competition, those kind of things. But in the top left of the last space there, where we have the nodes emerging, that might be areas where support is needed to grow it even stronger, but that's also where opportunities are for recombinant knowledge. If we go now one slide further, I think I show here a little bit this whole idea of diversity and relatedness. So on the vertical axis, we have entropy, so which is the notion of course, the more building blocks you have, the more you can combine, right? So if you have a lot of Lego pieces, you can probably build a lot of different things rather than if you only have one type of Lego piece. On the horizontal axis, we have average relatedness. So it captures basically how connected are the pieces in your locality. So think in this way, you could have many different knowledge types or domains in your region, but if they all remain unconnected, they will create silos. They will not create those kind of synergies of recombinant knowledge. So where you really want to be is on the top right here, right? So you want to have a lot of parts to play with, but they should all fit nicely together. So what we highlight here is the 11 LEPs of the North, showing where they're situated. And based on that graph, of course, one could think now about innovation policies, right? So if you're very low on the entropy, so on the diversity, you might want to focus on that, attracting firms that might focus on different areas that are not existing in your place, and so on. If you're very low on relatedness, you might even think the other way around and say, well, we have a lot of pieces in place, but they're all unconnected. So it might need more policies that would bring partners together in terms of starting collaborations and so on. If we go one slide further, and I think I will leave it then with that, what we looked in detail then in terms of the recombinant potential and realities. So who is combining what and to what extent? So if you look at the first line here, you have operations and chemistry. Operations and chemistry knowledge domains are the most combined ones in the North. So the occurrence kind of gives us a frequency of patterns that use that. And then we associated the LEPs that are dominant in that type of recombinant knowledge, and it goes on, goes down. So again, here it's the idea, if we think about collaborative research, if we think about networks and so on, it gives a very good indication where one might be able to start in terms of innovation policies and where to take it then from there. And yeah, I think I leave it there. Adam, I hand it back to you. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Dieter. That was fascinating. Even I've seen it before many times. So I will briefly, just before we have a kind of a Q&A session, I'll briefly just go over kind of a quick recap of what some of our kind of conclusions and recommendations were, and these are kind of broken down into the three sections. So firstly, from the logic map section, just a couple of key findings recap. So firstly, key point about innovation isn't just like a single event. It's not just one thing that happens or a specific outcome, but it's kind of a process, an interconnected process with lots of different stages. Each stage has its own spatial and institutional context that needs to be understood. And each stage is also driven and enabled by a web of factors that are all themselves interconnected. Effective policy interventions you need to understand the strengths and weaknesses across the whole system. You can't just pick one link and say, okay, we'll just improve this link, and not understand the fact that there may be feedback loops or other interdependencies. So key recommendations here. So like linear arguments, simple explanations are always really appealing. Everyone loves this idea. There's just kind of one key idea. If we just did this, then everything would fall into place. Reality doesn't work like this. It's important to understand, conceptualize the innovation process as a series of interlinked but separate stages, each driven by this series of mutually independent drivers, and to always look out for kind of feedback loops, be they positive or negative ones, balancing or reinforcing. And we think it's important to understand that innovation doesn't happen in isolation. It happens within the context of kind of wider policy, and therefore interventions must be designed to mesh with wider policy. So be that infrastructure support and infrastructure provision, or kind of spatial planning, skills and education programs, it all needs to be kind of thought of in a coherent whole. Some of the findings from our empirical analysis. So I won't read all out the findings, but fundamentally, there isn't a narrative, we don't think, that's just divided into North versus South. Rather, there seems to be a kind of a specific area that has specific attributes that is in the south of the country, but that it isn't the south of the country. So I think we need to think more critically about spaces of innovation, and not just reduce it to simple regional boundaries. There's a kind of a key finding about collaboration networks, and the fact that the areas that seem to do better in terms of all the kind of indicators of innovation seem to also coincide with an area that has a very dense collaboration network spanning a kind of a wider area. And we've identified that the presence of London as a key hub, but other regional hubs are important and exist. And it's not just about London. Innovation isn't just about London. It's in the spaces in between as well. And then also, so this question about, it's not just about large urban agglomerations, but the large urban agglomerations or larger cities do have a role to play, not as the location of innovation, but as hubs of collaboration between locations of innovation. And also the role of the public sector, key in kind of crowding in private research and investigation over the long run. So key kind of recommendations here. So I think it's important that the North doesn't try to copy the South. As we say, there's a variety of reasons why that isn't the appropriate policy measure. It's all about trying to understand the systems that underpin the success in innovation, and what it means to be a successful innovation in the ecosystem, and how through collaboration networks that reveal like related variety, areas can leverage their assets to become greater than the sum of their parts effectively. So that's kind of the lesson that I think needs to be taken away. And again, the North, what it needs to do is identify a complementary vision that builds on its existing strengths and relationships, rather than attempting to exactly represent the exact environmental conditions of the more kind of successful innovation area in the central south of the country. And finally, so we did this analysis led by Dieter into trying to understand what the knowledge space in the North looked like, how it compared to the rest of the country, and the key recommendations here. So in driving innovation activity, it's not just about how much R&D, it's about what R&D you're doing and how well designed it is and how well it meshes with what else is going on. the recommendation for the North as a whole is to try and identify, as Dieter's already kind of outlined, opportunities for future knowledge recombination, increased effectiveness through all stages of the innovation process. So it's not just about driving one stage; it's about seeking opportunities across all these stages and thinking about the context and the situation of that activity within its geography and within its geographical context. And finally, to get LEPs thinking about the same thing. So it's not just about what's the North's role within Britain, it's also about what are the LEPs' roles within the North, and identify their own kind of role within this ecosystem, identify their own knowledge recombination opportunities. So with that, I will hand back to Tim, and happy to take questions and comments.
Okay, great. So thanks all of you for that. The questions and answers box is there if people do want to add any questions. We've got a couple through which I'll kick off with. And like I say, do feel free to drop any others into the text. The first question that's come in really relates, I suppose, to a combination of what both Dieter and yourself, Adam, have said about the diversity and relatedness, and also the how that relates to the kind of the recombinant and the building. And thinking about the need to do this on a kind of an intra-regional scale versus an extra-regional scale, and what your thoughts were on that. And the question makes reference to the slide where you identified, I think, 6 of the 7 in the southeast, and what that might mean in terms of actions and how that could be supported.
Sure. So if I jump in and then maybe Dieter can pick up. So one of the maps that we didn't show were the levels of kind of diversity of economic activity across different LEP areas. And actually one thing that's quite interesting that emerged from that was that the LEPs in the high performing area tended to be slightly less diverse. They tend to be a bit more specialized than places like Manchester or Leeds across the kind of the wider British geography. And we think what this kind of implies is that they're able to be that specialist and still be successful, in part because they do have this strong collaboration network that then allows them to have this kind of specialized role within a kind of a wider, more diversified regional ecosystem, essentially. So they achieve related variety not through themselves diversifying, but through being relatively specialized, playing a relatively specialized role within a wider collaboration network. So I think there's a kind of a story there that could be explored in a bit more detail. Dieter, do you want anything you want to add?
No, I think you summarized it very good, Adam. I think especially for smaller geographies, that's a feasible strategy, right? It doesn't mean that you have to create all knowledge within your own boundaries, which is very challenging, especially for smaller jurisdictions. And then you help yourself, of course, with collaborations to the outside world. And there is something to be said to reduce the number of areas you're active in. I mean, it's easier said than it sounds a little bit like picking winners kind of strategy, which I think we don't like really. But in reality, as evolution goes, those things fall away eventually anyway. So if you would shift investments around, trying to back, let's call it dying sort of sectors and knowledge domains, might be really counterproductive and damage you in the long run.
Okay, thanks both. And a question, I suppose, about the thinking about the connectedness, obviously looking internally, but the importance within these kind of systems of looking internationally. And was there anything that the kind of study picked up about those connections that were kind of both, we've mentioned there about being extra regional, looking beyond the North, but what about the kind of international connections and how that feeds into the competitiveness of the North for research and innovation as well?
So, I mean, one of the things that we clearly identified was and this came through in the logic map, and then I think was supported by the data, was the role of international connectivity, be it collaboration networks that go outside of the UK, or even just kind of the presence of firms, multinational corporations or firms with headquarters outside the UK in an area, in terms of being a conduit for information that might otherwise not reach the local area. So it's that kind of conduit from international knowledge networks into local knowledge networks. And if that conduit works efficiently, then the knowledge soon disseminates from the kind of the international network that some of these multinational corporations or kind of international researchers might be involved in, into the local network. And the quicker it evolves, the more kind of potential areas for it to be usefully adopted. So I think that definitely came through, both in terms of the literature, the logic mapping, and then it seemed to hold up in terms of the areas of the UK or the areas of Britain that seem to have high levels of international HQs, high levels of international connectivity. I'm really interested in how this plays out in the future, and the extent to which digital connectivity, social networks are a substitute or a complement for physical international connectivity. Obviously, if we were discussing this 12 months ago, you might have a slightly different take on it. And the extent to which the systems of conduits from international to local knowledge networks is going to change in the future because of that technological development. Dieter, did you want to say something about, we did look at patent data, didn't we, that went, or collaborations that went across international boundaries, although only briefly?
Yeah, no, we did. And I mean, no big surprises. I mean, it's also very much driven by the type of corporations that are located in the individual LEPs. I mean, if American, international, multinationals, then of course there's a high share of US co-inventors. In large, one could say the North doesn't deviate from the general patterns. If anything, in terms of intensity, it's a little bit behind, I guess. So one wouldn't need to find new collaboration or new partners, but might have to look into possibilities to intensify collaborations. I would say that would be the strategy there.
And Dieter, just to take that a step further, we've had a question asking about the nature of kind of investments, and not just the international dimension, but what the implications are for investment, or potentially the lack of investment, particularly in the North, and whether there was anything that came out on that front.
Yeah, no, we didn't really look. So with patents, it's difficult, right? Because we never know how much money an individual patent makes by the end. Now that there is policies like patent boxes that kind of attract international investors to do R&D in your jurisdictions for tax refunds on the profits of the products and processes. But in larger I mean, this is a little bit the bias, right? When you have those large multinationals finding new locations, being close to a major airport like Heathrow it seems to be ranking very, very high, right? So in terms of what you battle there is probably impossible. In that sense, I suppose what you have to do, you have to play up your specializations, right? So there's historical specializations, and through that, you might be able to then attract investments in terms of specialized knowledge that's just not available anywhere else. And if you then can play up recombinations of different types of specializations, that's basically where you then get a plain, level field, basically, in terms of competing with the big guys. And I suppose this would be the idea. I mean, some of the sectors in the North are very traditional, and one might not consider them like, the most advanced ones or the hot ones. But that's not said that they are essential building blocks in the economy, nevertheless. And as other places have not picked up on those or can't make up decades or even longer of expertise that has been building in the area, that's basically where you then compete very well, I suppose. But it's of course, one strategy.
Okay. The next question, maybe for Adam and Jen, I think, is asking about particularly some of the recommendations that you picked out, Adam, about the relevance of these at different levels. And obviously some of the analysis is done at NUTS regions and thinking about the kind of complexity of governance in those, but whether they would be rightly targeted potentially at local, regional or national stakeholders, and particularly given some of those kind of overarching policy challenges around the 2.4%, the levelling up agenda, the R&D roadmap, and also things like net zero targets. And so was there a sense of these recommendations about who they were particularly pitched at? And I suppose to Jen, by extension, how does that then figure into the innovation process, which clearly has a kind of a regional, a very strongly regional angle to it, given the powerhouse, but also the wider range of stakeholders that are involved?
So, I mean, by necessity, the recommendations were aimed at the stakeholder group. The report was written for essentially, so that was the North as a whole. So trying to identify a strategy for the North, and then the LEPs within it. And I think there's a kind of a hierarchical component to this, and that it's probably some of the thinking and some of the analysis is relevant at the national level. Try and understand what Britain's specialization and potential role is within the global economy and the global innovation ecosystem. It then applies to subnational areas and regions, and however you want to conceptualize them, whether you see them as bigger than NUTS1, or smaller than NUTS1, but whatever there is, I think there's this kind of hierarchical element where it's identifying what the strategy is at the level above you, whatever geography you conceive yourself as, and then see what your role is within that, and then what the role of your subcomponents are. So we could be talking about, Northern LEPs within the North, within GB or within Europe or the global economy, and obviously there's a kind of a flexibility and a fuzziness around the edges of the different levels of the spatial hierarchy. So I think it's relevant no matter where you sit within that hierarchy, but the kind of optimum level of specialization or diversification will probably vary. The smaller spatial level you're conceiving of, probably the smaller number of things you want to specialize in, but then it's very important to try and establish strong collaboration links with other areas that have complementary specializations or kind of neighboring knowledge domains, whereby there is the potential for new recombinant knowledge to be sparked at the edge of those domains, should we say. Jen?
Yeah, I mean, I think you covered a lot of what I was going to say. I would say that, I mean, just to go back to this point where we wrote it for the specific stakeholder group, but originally, before we sort of settled on the final conclusions, we had recommendations that were slightly more general, and those of course focused on things like thinking about trying to understand again the sort of role of the capabilities of the different actors within the North relative to the bigger policy spaces that they might have to interact with. So it was really about thinking about not just looking endogenously, don't just look inside, but also try and do advocacy and try and shape policy at the national scale that might help to support the Northern ecosystem. And we got it. What was interesting is that I think rightly so, the stakeholders involved in that conversation were sort of like, we can't do everything. We have capabilities in these areas. We can't, we're expected to do a lot of stuff that we actually don't have the powers to do. And so we had to think a little bit more about how to gear these types of these recommendations to a group of stakeholders that doesn't control every lever. But the point still remained, right? Which is that it wasn't just look at what you can do, but look at what you can collaborate with each other, both horizontally across the region to accomplish, and what you can also collaborate with in the multi-level context about to try and get done. And so when we think about the logic map, like bring it back to the sort of conceptual level, that was always very much built with a sort of endogenous lens, right? We weren't really looking outside of the boundaries. We were acknowledging that those existed, but it was sort of meant to be kind of, here's the boundaries around a place, like what are you tinkering with there? Which constellation of actors, local and external, that you would want to bring to bear on a specific problem would vary depending on which particular driver or enabler you are trying to tweak or trying to be involved with. So this isn't the case of a place where we can be like, the strategy is like, we need to just get everybody involved in everything. It's more of a like, for each individual LEP, for instance, try and figure out where those critical paths are and where your capabilities lie, where other capabilities that you need to leverage are, and what sorts of partnerships you need to create to make those function. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. And I suppose just a final question, I think, as we come to perhaps draw it to a close and ask all of you for your reflections on this. But in some ways, the component pieces across the different regions, and particularly in the Northern Powerhouse, feel to be there. It's often the kind of the weaving of them together and the kind of the responsibility that falls between the cracks, as everyone, while pulling in the same direction, is challenged by the fact that there are certain areas that are everyone's responsibility, but no one's responsibility all at once. And just in terms of kind of moving this forward and perhaps thinking beyond the North and the wider implications here, how do you see that playing out? What's the way to kind of address this challenge in the most meaningful way moving forward?
So like every piece of analysis that I read on the innovation situation in the North concluded that it had a huge number of assets, but they were never kind of linked together, and actors didn't coordinate from one area of the North to the other. And I think partly that was through a lack of a coherent framework where they could try and figure out how to do that. And I think the benefit of this analysis is that, I mean, it's not by any means conclusive or the answer, but I think it's a step in the direction of trying to provide a framework through which actors that currently aren't collaborating can try and identify opportunities to do that. I think there's some serious questions about who those actors need to be. The kind of the obvious thing at the moment is just the LEPs, but there probably needs to be a more coordinating central body. It'd be great if some national level of organization was involved here.
Okay, Jen, Dieter, anything you'd like to add?
I think
okay.
I'm good.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, I'd just like to thank Adam, Jen and Dieter for their contributions this afternoon and making the presentation. There's going to be further events coming up with the Productivity Insights Network as well, which I'd encourage you to dial into and share details of. The slides from today we'll make available through the Productivity Insights Network as well. So if I can again just thank the speakers, thanks for those that have come along this afternoon and given us some of the questions. And I think a full version of the report is soon to be publicly available if it's not already. Is that right, Adam?
Yeah, that's right. Should be released very shortly.
We'll make a link available to that as well. So thanks again, everyone, for dialing in this afternoon, and hopefully we'll see you at the next event with the Productivity Insights Network. Thank you.
Thanks very much.